Hi, my name is Adolin, and this is Adolin Reads. I'm going to talk about books I like, authors I like, things I like in literature, and there's no real format for it, just whatever happens, happens. For the first episode, first video ever, I'm going to talk about something by the author that I've just fallen in love with in the last year. His name is Brandon Sanderson. He writes fantasy and a little bit of sci-fi, and I first discovered his book. A roommate of mine, actually a new roommate, introduced me to The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, and it's the first book in the Stormlight Archive, which is going to be a 10-book series, and they're not short books, but they're amazing. It's great. I fell in love with it. I absolutely enjoyed everything about The Way of Kings, so I read the next book by him and the next book by him and then the previous books by him, and now I've read everything, including his young adult stuff, except he's got a kids kind of series called Alcatraz versus the, which I'm sure is great too, but I haven't gotten to it. So I'm going to talk about first Mistborn. This is my expensive, cool version of it. It was a Christmas present from my grandfather. Actually, no, wait. This one is from my mother. The sequels, leather-bound version, is from my grandfather. So it's got a bunch of cool art in it, a bunch of fan art and commissioned art, and then an explanation of allomancy and feruchemy, which are the magic systems, and then just map of the world and high-quality stuff. This is awesome in itself, this collector's edition book, but what's inside of it is more important, right? So I've got some things I love about it, a few criticisms. This was his early stuff. His first book was Elantris. This was his first trilogy. I believe his second published book was Mistborn itself. So we're going to talk about it in three sort of segments here. One you just saw, which is a bit of an overview. Brandon Sanderson himself, he's a fantasy writer. He writes very long stuff. He's extremely prolific. He writes like a book a year, sometimes two. It's crazy. And he writes primarily fantasy with a little bit of sci-fi. He's well known for a couple of things. That probably the two biggest things he's known for are his magic systems, which are hard magic systems with clear rules that are just a blast to play with in the world. They're great magic systems, and he plays with them really well, where people kind of bend the rules and twist the rules without ever breaking them. It's very cool. And the other thing he's known for is his twist endings, and something that's called, tied into that, something that's called the Sanderson Avalanche by his fans, where in his longer books, and his shorter ones, it's in a shorter period, but for the longer books, the last 200 pages or so, he tends to have several different storylines going, and they crash together in the last section of the book during the Sanderson Avalanche, where nothing ever happens the way you expect. No matter how many of his books you read, it's always not the way you expected it to be. And it's just so cool, and it's full of twists and turns and character interactions that don't go the way you would have thought, but they're ways that completely make sense when you're reading them. And it's just awesome. So next section is going to be the things I like, which I'm going to put into three main categories. One is the world building. The world building is amazing. The basic concept of this world is, what if you wrote a story that took place after the great evil was defeated by the hero of legends, and the Dark Lord was vanquished, and now the hero's here and he's in charge, and it turns out that the hero's not such a great guy, and he turns into a Dark Lord of his own. So the prophecy's been fulfilled, and the great evil of legend has been vanquished, and now it turns out that not everything's great afterwards. By default, it's not a fairy tale ending. The hero that defeated the evil is not such a great guy in his own right. So that's kind of the setup. So he's the master of the world now. He's the emperor of the Eternal Empire, right? And it turns out that he's not a good guy. So this is the story of what follows that. A guy named Kelsier and a girl named Vin, and a cast of characters that are part of the criminal underworld take on the system, the empire, the emperor, who is this all-powerful godlike being who was the hero of legends. And it's great. There's all kinds of aesthetic decisions in this world. There's thick mists that are always around, sometimes thicker than other times, but always there. And ash is always falling from the sky. It's this bleak. Plants are all brown and shriveled. It's this bleak world full of bleak caste system where the great evil was defeated, and it turns out that the world's only darker for it. Right? It's a really bleak setting with a magic system based all around metals, which actually is in its own way very bleak. It's like this a very cold basis where most worlds, most universes, the magic system is based around like nature, fairies and sunshine and stuff, and like we derive our power from our souls and things like that. Where in this universe, in this world, the magic is from metal and minerals and rocks. I think it just fits in with the theme of cold, bleak, detached nonsense. Just this very oppressive setting to start out in, which makes it all the more satisfying as you see the main characters and the side characters in this big act of rebellion. And they're not these, like, most of them aren't these idealistic Luke Skywalker farmer characters. They're criminals and thieves and criminal underlords that are just like all brought together by Kelsier to fight the system, and it's really cool. So that's the setting. One of the other things I really love from it is we got the setting, we've got the characters and character interactions, which is amazing. A lot of the characters in Sanderson's books are not realistic people, and I don't think they're meant to be. It's not like a human being with normal human being reactions, though they do have very human interactions. Their characters are very archetypal, right? So this character is kind of representation of greed, and this character is a representation of honesty. And he plays on that in fun ways, where he puts the character that is a representation of honesty in a situation where their honesty is actually detriment to all their friends and the cause. Or he puts a character whose representation is greed in a situation where their greed is actually a great boon to the cause and good. And that's just really fun stuff that he does. And the best strength of his characters is the interplay between the characters. The scenes where they're talking to each other, they're bantering, they're fighting or arguing with one another. Those are the best scenes by far, in my opinion, in his books, where you really see those characters clash or gel in almost exclusively ways that you didn't think was going to happen. And it never feels cheap either. It never feels like he made it happen just to subvert your expectations. It's just, in his mind, this is how that interaction would go, and it's just different than the obvious. And the third thing I really love, so we got those two, and the third thing I really love is the outside of the world building, which is the first one, right, which includes the magic system, allomancy and feruchemy, which I'm not going to get too much into, but they're great. And the characters and character interactions. The third thing I love might tie into the second one a little bit, but it's the main character, who's Vin. And Vin is she is a strong female character in every way a great way. I think a lot of times strong female characters are really poorly written, even when they're written by women. I don't know why, but they tend to write one of these three kind of cheesy archetypes for what a strong female character is, and they never seem like real people, and it's almost always silly. Even in some of the better written ones, like even though it's a young adult book and it gets a lot of flack, I think Katniss in the first Hunger Games book was a pretty well written character, but even she was part of this sort of archetype, and these really passive characters that they're these strong female badasses, and yet they're always just reacting to things. It's always just reacting, whether it's in their relationships or in the wider world where they're fighting evil or whatever it is. They're always just reacting to things that are coming at them. I don't know why this is, but I think that that's very true in literature and in movies and TV shows. For a lot of female characters, when they're in the lead, they're very much a reactionary character, where the better written characters, and a lot of male characters do this by default, even when they're poorly written, are much more active agents. And that's something that I think is very true about Vin, this main character. She's an active agent. She does things because she has character motivations that make sense, and these drive her to do things that sometimes are counter to what might be good, what might be inherently the best decision you can make, or what might be right. But for her character, it makes more sense because her motivations are not necessarily just to be a good guy. She's a human being, right? And I think that that's amazing. And I think that makes her a much stronger character for it. Her character development is great, and there's a lot more to her and as she develops, but I don't want to throw any spoilers out there. Just to tell you, to start out, she's a street urchin with a relationship with her brother that you see right at the start, where it makes you feel really bad for her as a character. She's clearly grown up through a series of hard knocks, and her big break at the start is to hook up with a group of criminals, and even that looks like, wow, good for her, right? And then she builds out from there. So that's all very cool. I'm going to take a break, and this is going to be a jump cut. So, what's next after that, right? The 3 things that I dislike. And the things I dislike are much smaller than the things I like. I really love this book. I'll give you a rating at the end, but 3 things I dislike. 1, the explanation of the magic system seems very much like a video game tutorial. In later books, he gets much better at working this in organically, where it's these complex things, so it's still being explained to you very explicitly. But in this one, it feels like a video game tutorial. It's like, these are your powers. This is how they work, this is how they can't work, this is how you can use them, and this is where it comes from, and here's some lore, and this massive exposition dump that's just poured onto you. I don't think it's too fast. Necessarily, it's not too fast to follow, but it is a break in the story. It makes sense what's happening. It's not like it doesn't make sense at all. A mentor is teaching their student, but I think that it's not done very artfully. It stops the pacing in its tracks to explain how the magic works. I'm not saying I could do better necessarily, but he gets better at it later, and I think that improves in the later books. In this one, it's kind of cheesy. You're sitting there like, this is very explicit. I'm not really in love with the delivery, in my opinion, anyway. One of the other negatives I'd say is in the first book, there is the main character, a lot of the purpose of her is that she's not this typical female lead, but she gets relegated for a while into this, like, going to balls, and it all makes perfect sense in the story. It's actually really well done, but it's like this romance angle on things, and going to these balls, and her character gets a little caught up in that, which I felt perfectly in character. I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying it's bad, but I just kind of wish he went a slightly different direction with it, because I think he did a great job of avoiding a lot of the common pitfalls for female leads, where people really write female characters into boxes, I think. And in this way, he kind of maybe dragged himself back a little bit there, in my opinion. I wish there was a little less time and focus on the parties and the romance, and a little more focus on her, like developing her skills maybe. But that's a minor thing. So those are the first 2 and the bigger ones, and then the third one, which it applies to this book, but not the whole trilogy. The rest of the trilogy kind of negates this, but I'm reviewing this book, right? And there's a point where the book really shifts. It's a watershed moment. I don't want to give you spoilers, but something major happens, and you see the antagonist for the first time really clearly, and there's this big scene that occurs, and I really think that in this book, it seemed fairly anticlimactic, right? And it's not when you get to the later ones. Like I encourage, if you don't like it, like I've read in Reddit and things, a lot of people did not like this portion of it, and they didn't read later. I encourage you to read the later books because it kind of retcons it a little bit. Though I do think it was the plan the whole time. Retcon's probably not the right term. Doesn't matter. Point is, there's a part here where you kind of go, where I went, well, that was a little lame. I don't know if that was. I don't know if that was powerful enough for the moment that it was. And it's kind of a very important point for the book. So that, I think, could have been done better. I don't know how I would have done it better, especially knowing how it ends. I think it was done very well. But the point of this book being to make you love this book enough to read the next one, for a lot of people that turned them off, and for me, it definitely wasn't perfect on delivery. So that's just something that I would put in the negative column, and I know that it's really vague if you haven't read the book. If you have, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So those are my 3 points in both ways. So Brandon Sanderson's the author. The book is Mistborn. The 3 things I love about it are the world building and the magic system are amazing. The characters and character interactions I think are great. And the main character and her development and the writing of her as a female lead are just tremendous. 3 things I didn't like were much smaller, kind of nitpicky things. 1, I don't like the delivery of the magic system. I think that it stopped the pacing in its tracks for a little bit. 2, I think that the politicking portion of the book that kind of really gets into the parties and the romance and stuff is great, but I just don't know if it necessarily was the best route for this character, especially with the kind of breaking the mold theme of it. And then the 3rd kind of nitpick I had was there's a portion that's supposed to be very climactic that just a lot of people agree with me, and I think when you're first reading it, when you're reading just the first book, seems pretty anticlimactic. So I really suggest it. My rating for this book is a 8 out of 10. I love it. It's not short, but it's not exceedingly long either. Like some of Sanderson's books get very long. This one is in a pretty reasonable reading range, and I love the characters. I love it, and I highly suggest it. I give it an 8 out of 10. The whole trilogy, I'm not going to rate for you yet, but I'm going to do the other 2 books as I go through. And yeah, I think that it's really worth your time to read. If you have read it, if you haven't, I'm very happy to discuss it in more detail in the comments section. And I'll put spoilers. Make sure you put spoilers, because I don't want to ruin anything by Sanderson for anybody. Heavily, for anyone that hasn't read his stuff, heavily twist-based writing sometimes, and you really don't want spoilers, I promise. So thank you, anybody that made it to the end and listened to this review. I appreciate your time, and I'll be back next week with another one. Have a good day.